Okay, this is our last piece about culture. And, we've talked so much about culture in this monolithic fashion, this idea that um, various societies sort of share cultural approaches, cultural practices, behaviors, ideologies, etc. Um, but you've also seen this clip that exemplifies intergenerational cultural differences. And I think that it's important to note that, as sociologists, we're trying to understand something in a pattern based fashion about society, right? We're trying to understand what is the general cultural sentiment of this group of people. What do their practices say about who they are? But that said, we as individuals, even raised in the same society, can be so different from each other, right? So, um, some people might be into like WrestleMania, and other people are into high school football, and other people are into golf. And probably when you think about the stereotypical image of individuals who are into those three things, you get very pictures of who those people are. What do they look like? What are they wearing? What are their hairstyles, right? What kind of music do they listen to? And so we're able to kind of lump people into these different categories, these different subcultural categories based upon their likes and their dislikes. Another example might be like musical taste. And um, I don't know if this is still true to the same extent, but when I was in high school, we were very largely clicked based upon our musical preferences. So, where I grew up in Perry County, Pennsylvania, most people listen to country music. And I decided that I hated country music. I was not going to listen to country music past the 2000s anyway, sometime around then. And I started listening to, of course, emo music, because what could be cooler for your intro to Soch instructor to say right now than that they listen to emo music? Like a couple days ago, I listened to the album Three Cheers for Sweet. I'm going to go ahead and say that that is an excellent quarantine album. If you're feeling, if you're feeling any anger or grief about the situation, you're going to really enjoy listening to that album right now. Um, Here I am exposing the inner contents of my psyche as I say these things to you in an anonymous feeling way, when in fact, you're all going to know that I'm listening to MCR. Okay, point being that when I was in high school, I thought it was so cool. I was listening to emo music, right? All my friends had swoopy hair. We had um those like stripes in our like scene mullets. We were wearing t-shirts from Hot Topic, right? And that's a clique. That's my mom. Um Kind of tight-laced, Republican. She's married to a lobbyist. She she's a little bit. She calls herself moderate, but anyway, she's sort of like this kind of person who plays into like niceties, and is very much like uh, traditional, I think, in her approach to life. So how did I, as the child of this person who subscribes to her own set of values and her own set of beliefs, how did I grow up um, into a scene where I'm going to watch my brother's band play screamo shows in what is essentially an abandoned warehouse next to a river, right? And my mom is there standing in the background in like her loft um, blouse and her cropped whatever pants. So it's such a stark comparison, right? And I think that we can all ask that about ourselves. We're different from our parents in some ways. Some of us are very similar to our parents in other ways. Um, but why? If socialization is this um, very very important factor in terms of how we become who we become, then why are we so different from our parents if we are? Or why are we so different from our peers? Or why do we have different interests in this kind of nuanced way? And I just think that this is sort of a fascinating question to try to dig into and from a sociological standpoint, understand why you've developed the interests that you have. Um, so, yeah, while culture plays a role, you have to have access to the things that you like. That's culture, right? You live in this bubble of things that you can access, um, but you choose from those things. And so, how do we choose what we choose? Okay, so there are a couple of theories. One theory is reflection theory. That's this idea that culture is like a projector and we're just sort of the screen that receives that reflection. Another theory is the cultural toolkit theory. And this theory, I think, gives a lot more agency to the individual because it's this idea that culture does surround us, kind of like we have this toolkit available to us at all times, and we might each have different toolkits. So each different toolkit might have different kinds of tools in it, and maybe we're more likely to have a certain kind of tool or various forms of the same kind of tool if we live in um, let's say, rural America versus um, urban America. But that said, we still have a toolkit. So we still have agency or choice in terms of choosing which of those tools we're going to pull out and we're going to use, and which of those tools makes sense in a particular cultural domain. It kind of links back to code switching, this idea that we're carrying around this toolkit all the time that enables us to choose the cultural tool that makes sense in that particular context. Reflection theory, on the other hand, is this idea that we're just kind of blank absorbers of the culture that's put onto us. It doesn't really give us room for agency, but it can explain why we as individuals have a really tough time being innovative or being creative, right? The things that we create, we talked about this a couple clips ago. The things that we create, are they ever really new, or are they coming from the things that already surround us? So I think that both have kind of a valid backing, and both are interesting ways to explain how culture sort of permeates us as individuals and how we actually navigate and take from culture. But I think toolkit theory helps explain maybe um, those differences a little bit better, right? Reflection theory, going back to my example from my childhood, would suggest that I would become like a mini version of my mom, which I haven't really. Um, my toolkit probably was different tools were placed into it via what I saw in the media that I was watching or consuming, the different kinds of people I interacted with as I grew up. So my neighbors, my peers in school, right? Like I might have had different tools put into my toolkit just via those interactions, and that differed from those of my parents because they didn't have those same experiences and those same interactions. And so, again, toolkit theory allows us to, or helps us to explain why we might choose certain tools, why certain tools would be easier for some of us to use than others. And again, tools being representative of these kind of cultural representations that we put on our tastes, our preferences, the way we present ourselves, etc. So it does link the individual back to structure because, again, the tools come from somewhere. They come from these various institutions and the individuals that we interact with within those institutions. But um, it's still potentially, it can be criticized because if you really think about it, like when you were growing up, did you actually choose how to become who you became? Or does reflection theory have a little bit more substance here, right? Like maybe, again, thinking of the fish in water, were you were you indoctrinated in some ways into certain beliefs? So again, you can go back and forth between those two. This is Anne Swidler. She's the one who came up with toolkit theory. I think she's really brilliant, so if you ever get a chance to read her, I definitely recommend it. Okay, and then finally, subculture. So, of course, we talked about subculture, taste, preference. Um, it is very interesting to think about how cultures form within a broader dominant narrative. And so a subculture is a group united by a set of concepts, values, symbols, and shared meaning that is specific to that group. So if you are someone who plays Dungeons and Dragons, which I'm not, but my partner really wants to be. So she is listening to podcasts. She's trying to learn like the terminology. She's trying to be able to enact this cool pose and join a D&D, I don't even know what you call it, squad, whatever. And she has to actually sort of learn about their practices and what they think to be able to enter um, this force of people. Um, and it's kind of fascinating because there are all these symbols here that I'm not going to understand, despite the fact that my partner and I belong to the same general cultural background. So when we talk about subculture, they're defined in opposition to mainstream culture, and again, it goes back to this concept of culture being relative, right? So you're comparing what's different about this subculture, what makes it stand out from the dominant narrative culture. Um, that's the opposition piece. But you have to remember that subcultures still play into that dominant framework. So they're not thinking along ideological lines that drastically counter whatever the main message is for a certain society. They can highlight mainstream norms in some ways. Um, they oppose mainstream norms in others, but they still, when you boil it down, they still at least fit within that narrative. Like there are ways that you can explain, okay, this makes sense that sure these Chewbacca's or I don't know what they are here. There's something that they believe in about kind of the story that's told in Star Wars that actually fits this mainstream narrative. And even though they're doing this cosplay here, which is probably something that many Americans do not engage in, there are still norms and ideologies that underlie what both groups believe in that can align. This is different from a counterculture, and a counterculture really opposes mainstream norms, is really trying to change mainstream norms, and is actively sort of fighting against those norms. So make sure that you know the difference between subculture and counterculture as you move forward and kind of use those terms in your life.